Welcome, everybody, to the second installment of the Fellows Colloquium series here at the Hutchins Center. It's good to see all of you, including some old friends. Today, our speaker is Rita Fried. She is Chair Emerita at the Department of Ancient Egyptian, Nubian, and Near Eastern Art at the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. She also teaches Egyptian and Nubian art at Wellesley College. Not long after earning her doctorate in Egyptian and ancient Near Eastern art and archaeology at the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University, Rita Fried served as Associate Professor of Art at the University of Memphis and as founding director of the Institute of Egyptian Art and Archaeology at the university. Dr. Fried has excavated in Egypt at numerous sites from the Delta to Karnak, as well as in Israel and Cyprus. She has curated or co-curated numerous exhibitions, including Egypt's Golden Age, A Divine Tour of Ancient Egypt, Ramses the Great, Pharaohs of the Sun, The Secrets of Tomb 10A, and Ancient Nubia Now. Currently, she is the Richard D. Cohen Fellow in Art History here at the Hutchins Center, where she is pursuing research in Nubian art and developing strategies to make it more widely known and accessible. Please welcome Dr. Fried.
Hooray! Thank you, Krishna.
Well, let me echo that. Thank you. Greetings all. As Krishna told you, for the past year, I've enjoyed the tremendous privilege of being a fellow here at the Hutchins Center, where my focus is to develop materials, as you heard, materials that will captivate a wide audience with the splendors of ancient Nubian art. And my focus is also to share broadly the knowledge of this great series of empires that unfortunately all too few are privy to today. Now, knowing full well that 7,000 years of civilization of Nubia might be a little too much to present in the next hour, I've decided to pick Nubia's most celebrated king, Taharqa, a man who lived from 721 to 656 BCE. Let me advance this. Here we go. This is a king whose kingdom included both Nubia and Egypt. And I want to tell you the story of his life in a way that will make him come alive for you. Because in his case, uniquely, we are blessed with a tremendous richness of ancient sources. So, for example, we have in his own words, i.e. what he wanted us to know about himself, and I quote, a champion, a powerful king who has no equal, at the sight of whom every face is dazzled. Well, he's not shy. We also have his account of historical events, like as you see written on this stela from Kawa in Nubia. There are a whole series of these stelae and inscriptions on temple walls. And these we need to view more or less like bulletin boards or government press releases, but again, through Taharqa's eyes. In addition to these, we have what other cultures, the Assyrians and the Bible, say about him. And we might think of those as press releases from other points of view. And additionally, we have his creations, both in terms of sculpture and architecture. And they are found throughout Taharqa's 1,500-mile-long empire from Khartoum to the Delta in Egypt. So what I will try to do here is to conjure up Taharqa, the man as well as the king, to get inside his head, to read between the lines. So consider this a biography of Taharqa through my eyes, because I find him very much alive, very human, a man who expressed both his triumphs and his failings in a way that really touch us today. I also chose him to cause his name to live. That is to say, to make information about him better known. because the sources we have are in various languages, scattered throughout books and journals, and primarily geared for a scholarly audience. In short, difficult for the average person to access. So I hope that by doing this, I will convince you that he deserves to take his place among the great kings of the world, and that you will join me in making this happen. So first, a word on terminology. Nubia, encircled by this gray area. Nubia is a geographical area that comprises the area from Khartoum to here, just north of Aswan in Egypt. Its culture and people go back tens of thousands of years, and it is still a thriving culture today. And I'm happy to say that I know some Nubians are with us now. Another word, Kush. From about 2000 BC on, it's a word that both the Nubians and the Egyptians used to connote this civilization, to describe the different empires along the Middle Nile. I will use Kush and Nubia interchangeably. So with that by way of introduction, let's go back to Taharqa's time. That is over 2,700 years ago. First, some quick facts. Taharqa ruled one of the largest empires of the ancient world. And that empire included the Nile Valley from Merowe, right here, all the way up to the Delta, an area of approximately 1,500 miles. And he ruled as king for 26 exciting, tumultuous, and very busy years, 690 to 664. His father was the great King Pianki that I know many of you have heard of. Pianki, some 37 years earlier, had allied himself with the priesthood in Thebes in Egypt against the, Thebes is about right here, against the, against the encroachment of vassals from the Delta. Now, Pianki led an army from Nubia into Egypt to support these priests from Karnak. Thereby, Pianki conquered and succeeded in uniting this vast Nilotic empire that included Kush and Egypt. Now, already there was a natural liaison between Nubia and Egypt, thanks to their shared god, Amun. Amun is shown here as a human male, this beautiful gold statue in the Metropolitan Museum, and his homeland, his chief temple, was here at Karnak. Pianki's two successors, Shabbatako and Shabako, further consolidated this vast empire. So enter Taharqa. We first meet him not as king, but as a prince of 20 years old. The year is 701 BCE. The Nubian king Shabbataka, who was ruling from Egypt, singled out Taharqa in Nubia and summoned him to Egypt. And he summoned him to lead a contingent of soldiers to the Levant, that is the Eastern Mediterranean, to fight off the Assyrians. Excuse me. Now, the Assyrians were an empire from about 1000 BC on, and year by year increased their empire. Now, fighting the Assyrians was a pretty heady task for a kid of 20. But before I tell you the outcome of this battle, I want to step back and look at what Taharqa's life would have been like growing up. So here was this blue circle encompasses the area in which Taharqa grew up, and it's an area known as Napatan, around the fourth cataract of the Nile. This is where his great-grandfather, grandfather, and father came from, an area that included this holy mountain called Jebel Barkal, a natural promontory about 350 feet high, at a site at which the earlier Egyptian conquerors had dedicated to the god Amun, the god I mentioned earlier. Now, as you can see here, Jebel Barkal stood out for miles in this otherwise flat landscape. But this area in general was special because unlike the rest of the Nile, which flows, as you know, from south to north, emptying into the Mediterranean, in this area, the Nile flows from north to south in this great bend, rather than the opposite. And it's also an area where the floodplain broadened, thereby allowing the Nile to deposit fertile soil along its banks in its annual flood. And therefore, crops here could grow easily, unlike other parts of the Nile. Moreover, the area of Napatan, right here, was an area where many wadis led both east and west. And of course, the Nile led north and south. So this made Napatan just the epicenter of a bunch of trade routes. It was a prosperous area that gave rise to the dynasty, the Napatan dynasty that Taharqa came from. What we do know about Taharqa is that already at 20, he was a standout in Napatan. Now, granted, he was Pianki's son, but since we know Pianki had at least 6 wives, he undoubtedly had many, many sons. We know that Taharqa's people, the Nubians, were known for their strength and their fighting ability. And what you see here is a platoon of Nubian soldiers found in an Egyptian tomb and made 1300 years before Taharqa lived. And what you see are what the Nubian soldiers look like. You see their characteristic skin color, their hairstyle, their leather garments, likely encrusted with beadwork. And not only in Egypt, but in Nubia as well, weaponry abounded. Weapons like this child's dagger, a mere 7 inches long, made of ivory, gold, and bronze. Beautifully balanced, a beautiful object, but really a deadly stiletto. So what this shows us is that hunting and warfare were very much a part of the Nubian upbringing. So in short, the young Prince Taharqa came to his skills in hunting and warfare naturally. It was in his DNA. So when Taharqa was summoned to Egypt at 20, he likely had at least 1 wife. We actually know the names of 5 of them, 3 of whom, like Taharqa, were also children of Pianki. So they were at least his half-sisters, keeping the bloodline pure. Ultimately, we know he had at least 3 sons and 4 daughters, and likely countless more for which there is no historical record. Now, the records we do have are in Egyptian writing, the lingua franca, Egyptian hieroglyphs, the lingua franca of the time. But the language Taharqa spoke was likely a language called Meroitic. At the time, there was no written form of that language, and it wasn't written down, in fact, until 350 years later, at least as far as we know. Now, there's a reason Shabbataka, the king, needed help from Prince Taharqa. And that reason was the Assyrians, the other great empire at the time. The god of Assyria was Ashur, and Ashur demanded more and more territory. He demanded that his subjects set out to conquer more territory every year. More territory meant more tribute to fill his treasury. So by the 8th century BC, Assyria had reached the Levantine shores right here. And he was receiving tribute from him. But Shabbataka, the king of Egypt and Nubia, and himself a brilliant strategist, observed that there were some problems within the Assyrian Empire, and he seized the moment. He wanted that tribute from the Levant for himself. So Taharqa set out from Napatan with his army up to Egypt. Now, to give you a sense of what we're talking about, just from Napatan to Memphis was at least 1,400 miles, a journey of at least 2 months, and undeniably a very complicated undertaking. Because it wasn't just Taharqa and his men, it would have been the horses, the chariotry, the infantry, the supplies, not to mention the women, the children, and the entertainers. So after reaching Egypt, He was joined by Egyptian soldiers and went on to Israel right here. He went on to help the kingdom of King Hezekiah of Judah to combat the Assyrian army. Now, the Assyrian king Sennacherib had chased Hezekiah to Jerusalem's gate. So Assyria was right about there where Jerusalem is located. So the two armies face to face. What was the outcome? Well, depends upon who you look to for answers. The Nubian side is silent. The Egyptian side is silent. But in the Bible, 2 Kings 18:19 and 2 Chronicles 32, we read that thanks to divine intervention, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died in one night. And Jerusalem, after all, was saved from Assyrian invasion. But now let's look at the Assyrian side. The Assyrians were prolific record keepers, and these are King Sennacherib's annals. In these, and I don't read cuneiform, but I'm told, he boasts of receiving the following tribute from King Hezekiah of Judah: 200,150 prisoners, 30 talents of gold, which equals $12 million, 300 talents of silver, mere $2 million. Not, excuse me, not bad. So in short, both Assyria and Judah claim victory. What is the real story? Well, the Assyrians did not invade Jerusalem right away, and Taharqa and his army came home to Egypt, having received military experience and a taste of Assyrian brutality. But this is not the last we hear of the Assyrians. Their presence hung over the world like the sword of Damocles. But what about Prince Taharqa? We know that he remained in Egypt, but other than that, the records are silent for the next 11 years. Shabako succeeded Shabbataka as king of Cush in Egypt, and then it was Taharqa's turn. The details of how Taharqa came to the throne are a little murky. We think there might be something slightly irregular, but we don't know exactly what. He was the son of Pianki, after all, not the previous king, Shabaka. We, of course, have Taharqa's version here on this stela. And there he tells us Amun, the god the Nubians shared with the Egyptians, chose him. And in another place, he tells us, and I quote, "I was elevated above my brothers," making it sound as if there were an election and he was chosen by them. Well, the fact is, we don't know what the selection process was in Cush. But we do know that Taharqa was 31 years old at the time, in his prime, and the year was 690 BC. Another thing we know is that Taharqa was the first Cushite king to be crowned in Memphis, here in Egypt, the site of the pyramids. So what a power statement that was. A power statement for both the Nubians and the Egyptians. And you have to ask, how did the Egyptians feel to have a foreigner crowned king of Nubia in Egypt? This is especially in light of the fact that for thousands of years, the Nubians had been shown as enemies, had been depicted in demeaning poses by the Egyptians. As Ramses the Great, the looming large over the Nubians does here in this relief. Well, Taharqa was shrewd. He made sure everyone in Egypt knew his triumph, and in Nubia too. So he set about telling everybody, and he did that through his enormous building projects. So what would people have seen? They would have seen his many over life-size images and a powerful presence in these faces, ageless, timeless, confident. His strong, round face, eyes that don't look at you, but beyond you, broad cheeks set off, the nose set off from the mouth by this furrow here, a decided furrow in both relief and sculpture in the round. The mouth is straight, neither smiling nor frowning, a little indented at the corners. He had a perfect body, broad shoulders, narrow waist, well-defined pectorals in these two statues here, one in Khartoum, the other in Kerma, both in Nubia. And these, to me at least, convey a sense of openness, of honesty, somebody who is secure in himself. But what did he really look like? The fact is we don't know. Because art of the time was idealizing, not meant to be true portraiture, but the way you wanted to be remembered for eternity. Now let's look further at his royal trappings. Here we see an image of Taharqa from a shrine in Nubia. Actually, I'm going to go back for a minute and point out here that he has a cap crown and two snakes at his brow. Now you can see that here to a certain extent. So these two snakes are uraei, royal cobras, who can be as long as 12 feet, 6 feet of which can stand upright and then pounce down on you. A really fitting image of terror if you're the opponent. So it's these snakes that are at the Kushite brows, the two of them, not just one, as you would have in Egypt. And further, you have around Taharqa's neck an image of a ram beautifully executed in gold in this other image. Now, and this was a standard part of the Nubian royal trappings. Now, why the ram? We'll get to that in a minute. But here you see a ram protecting the image of Taharqa. You see the power of that ram. And here you see the god Amun, the same god as we saw in Egypt, except not with a human face, but with a ram's face, ram's head. And here is Taharqa kneeling before him with his cap crown and double uraei. So why rams? Well, rams are known for their strength. They're an important part of the Nubian landscape. And most of all, they have a reputation for never giving up. They fight to the death. And so the way we've seen is the way Taharqa would be depicted for the next 26 years. So what do we know about his reign? Almost immediately, he began to transform both Nubia and Egypt with his monuments. The most important temple of the time, Karnak, the temple dedicated to the god Amun, that is the shared god of Egypt and Nubia. Now, Karnak, as you see here, is enormous and confusing, but let me break it down for you. So this is a cutaway of a temple. The temple is the home of a god, and the god lived in this small shrine in the back, the Holy of Holies, the smallest room. Only the high priests could access that. The entire view of what went on in the temple was blocked by this enormous gateway or pylon, of which there are many in Karnak. So the average person couldn't see a thing. However, there were festivals, and a lot of them. And that's where an image of the god was taken out in his boat, because that's the way they traveled. Here's the shrine, and you can see the curtain around the shrine is dropping ever so slightly so that the general public could get an image of the god inside. Now, when this god was taken out in parade, you have to imagine that the public was there to see the god, to join in this festival. And these events were like carnivals. You had food, drink, music, dance, the smell of incense, transporting you, all of these things into another realm. And you could watch the god go on his journey, perhaps to another temple, and return. And the first and last glimpse you would see of the god was through this narrow door of the pylon. So what does Taharqa do? He creates his own entryways into Karnak. 2 rows of 5 columns each. Those columns soar to an enormous 62 feet. They are the second highest columns in all of Karnak. They tower almost everything else. They're made of gleaming white limestone, and the floor is red granite. thanks to Tom, we have this image of what those porches might look like. So imagine your first and last view of the god was the god's procession coming out and going back in through these columns that bear Taharqa's name and Taharqa's image. You have to imagine this passionate, divine, theatrical event and these entryways at all the cardinal points of Karnak, totally transforming what that very important temple looked like. Unfortunately, this is really all we have left of the columns today. But it wasn't just at Karnak that Taharqa built those porches. Taharqa built elements, left inscriptions, or restored temples at 14 sites in Egypt at last count. His work and his image displayed like a billboard at all of Egypt's major population centers. He understood the power of image, the social media of his day. And he also understood the importance of shoring up his power in Nubia. So for Nubia, his homeland, he wanted the best of the best. Now, recognizing the long tradition in Egypt of building in stone, especially on a monumental scale, versus the tradition of building in mud brick in Nubia, what does Taharqa do? He brings the best to Kush. He sends Egyptian artists to build temples there, but temples according to his own instructions. We know this because he tells us. There's not much left of those temples today, but we do have this shrine in the Ashmolean Museum. It was a shrine inside the temple. And it offers us a good example of how Nubian art is unique. So not only do we have a dramatic visual display of kingship, as I described earlier, but look at the size of the figures vis-a-vis the height of the shrine itself. They are huge. They take up almost the full height. And there's not much in the way of inscription. Egyptian hieroglyphs, after all, are not the language of the Kushites. They spoke Meroitic. And the likelihood is that not many people in Kush read Egyptian. They didn't need to. A picture was worth 1,000 words. Now, there are many more manifestations of superhuman power of Taharqa in Kush, of which I'm going to show you just one. And I think this is the most dramatic. Remember that holy mountain, Jebel Barkal, shown here, the mountain, the natural 350-foot tall promontory you could see for miles away. Well, here is a close-up of it in the temple at the foot. Notice this pinnacle, 350 feet high above the ground. Imagine a ledge right here, and imagine a statue of Taharqa looking out at this vast plain. But beyond that, imagine on this flat surface an inscription proclaiming the glory of Amun with Taharqa's name writ large. Now, imagine that inscription covered in gold foil, gleaming like a beacon in the sun. We know it existed. We still have the nail holes and the nails. So you could see this clearly for miles around. So 2 out of the 16 sites in Nubia where traces of Taharqa are found, and add to that the 14 sites in Egypt, a total of 30 places that we know of. So from Meroe to the Delta, 1,500 miles by river, Taharqa is everywhere. Moreover, at least 3 sites in Nubia that we have found thus far, 2 of which were in the last 20 years, Taharqa erected colossal statues of himself, like this one in Khartoum. This one is the largest that I know of, and it's well over 15 feet tall. The king was a superhero. The king, after all, spoke to the gods. You, on the other hand, could speak to the king on his statues outside the temple, and the king would speak on your behalf to the gods inside. And remember, you could likely see these statues from miles away, because if you look at these areas that are not polished to a high gloss, like the cap and the uraei here, and the copious jewelry that you can't see too well here, Those were covered with a stucco, and that stucco was covered in gold. So all the accoutrements of the king glistening under the sun's rays. So lavish building activity, the likes of which neither Nubia nor Egypt had seen in over 500 years. Was this piety? Was this artful propaganda? Was it a way of employing the population like the WPA projects of our time, or all of the above? In any case, he needed a large treasury to pay for this. Now, Taharqa gives us a hint. It is year 6 of his reign, and he tells us, and I quote, "Wonders have occurred, the likes of which have not been seen since the time of the ancestors." What were these wonders? Well, remember, the lifeblood of his entire kingdom was the Nile and its annual flood, which deposited fertile soil. If the flood was not high enough, people starved. And apparently that was happening. But in year 6 of Taharqa's reign, it flooded higher than ever before. Specifically, 21 cubits, 1 palm, and 2.5 fingers, i.e. more than 36 feet. The land, in Taharqa's words, was a primeval ocean. Egypt was in happy festival, and the sky reigned in Nubia, he tells us. In short, he could grow more crops than before, and the crops brought wealth that could feed his people. The excess, of course, he could use for trade. Now, 36 feet of flood. Let's step back for a minute and put this in perspective. Your average flood is 6 to 7 feet. A 36-foot flood anywhere would be incredibly destructive. The mud brick houses would wash away, people and animals would drown, and in fact, 100 years prior to Taharqa, there had been an enormous flood that was just 2 inches lower than the one Taharqa describes. The king at that time called that flood disastrous, and I quote Assyrian III, "Citizens were like swimmers in the waves. Every temple in Egypt was like a swamp." So kudos to Taharqa and his understanding of human nature. He took something that must have been purely terrifying and presented it as something good. So good, he couldn't believe it himself. Bursting with pride, he wants to share it. So, who's the most important to him? His mama, of course, Queen Abalo, at home in Nubia, who he hasn't seen in 20 years. So he invites his mother to come to visit him. And she makes that trip, a trip of about 2 months, 4 years later. Now, here she is. These are 2 different inscriptions. Here she is right here, shaking his sister behind him, and here she is in line drawing. Here's King Taharqa making an offering to Amun. So if he was 41, she had to be at least in her mid-50s, if not older, making this trip over 1,000 miles. But she arrived safely, and in Taharqa's words, and I quote, "She was overjoyed when she saw the glory of his majesty resplendent in his royal trappings," as any mama would be. Imagine that reunion. Now, this was truly a high point for Taharqa. So we're sure that for the first 10 years of Taharqa's reign were truly good times for him. He had mastered that art of walking a tightrope and ruling a diverse stretch of 1,500 miles of the Nile. How did he do it? And for sure, the lifestyle in Egypt was different than the lifestyle in Nubia. The geography was different and so forth. So how did he keep this empire together? Well, he delegated. The day-to-day activities were handled by the mayor of Thebes, shown here, a man named an Egyptian with a long heritage, a long pedigree, a man by the name of Mentuhotep. Now, he clearly presents himself as a no-nonsense person. But bear in mind, his position allowed him to accumulate enormous wealth, in fact, enough to build the largest tomb in Thebes. But Mentuhotep was smart enough politically that he took a Nubian wife, Uta Renes, one of at least three that we know of. But the Nubians cannot have felt neglected at this time because the highest religious office was something called the God's wife of Amun. And to that, Taharqa appointed his sister, Shephenwepet II, seen here in this beautiful statue, clasping a vase with the head of Amun, now in the Berlin Museum. So, by the way, women, we know, played a much larger role in Nubian society than in Egypt, but that's another topic. So, in Nubia, Taharqa also displayed his power by making incredible donations to the temples he built, demonstrating power through piety. And I just want to single out one part of one list, the one from the temple at Kawa. So, his donation for a year included, in part, 50 vases with ram heads, 85 bronze vessels, 33 pieces of gold, incense, lapis from Afghanistan, turquoise from Sinai, cedar from Lebanon, and 6 golden cult figures, of which this one, a figure of the king kneeling before the god Hemen, may have been one. So as I said, this is just a partial list. Whether it's exaggeration or not, it clearly shows the internationalism of the time and the prosperity. But let's not forget that Taharqa is really a military man. And we're reminded of his military background when he staged a military exercise recorded on this stela found in 1997. It tells us that he organized a marathon that went from Memphis to the Fayoum and back in one night, 30 miles. Although he kindly tells us he gave the guys 2 hours to rest. And he took part in this marathon. Now, I have to step back and wonder if the US Army could do this today. And if they could, would the generals accompany them? Would they run the race? So why was Taharqa doing this? I think he realized that he had to get the army in shape. Let's not forget those Assyrians. We left them in 701 BC. That was when Taharqa at 20 had an encounter with them. In Assyria, meanwhile, there was a new king, a king by the name of Asarhaddon. And he went out from the Assyrian heartland to try to reclaim for Assyria the area of Judah and that very lucrative trade. It's March of 673 BC, year 17 of Taharqa's rule. Taharqa is 48 years old. Asarhaddon moves into the Egyptian territory, but Taharqa, with his army, beats them back, and Asarhaddon retreats. But Assyria is a war machine. 2 years later, in 671, in the summertime, because that's when they conducted their battles, Asarhaddon returns. And this time he fights his way into Egypt. Gets all the way to Memphis, the capital, and he conquers it and he sacks it. Taharqa is shot at least 5 times with Assyrian arrows. Badly wounded, he still gets away. However, his oldest son and his queen and his additional wives and his brothers, they were all captured and taken as spoils of war and deported to Assyria. And here we see his oldest son, Ushanhuru, in shackles. Noble, nevertheless. His dignity comes through to us, a true Kushite prince, shown here. So you have to imagine Taharqa's despair, 50 years old and wounded, unable to protect his family, knowing of their capture, but not knowing of their fate. Taharqa does the only thing he can do, and that is he makes a desperate, very personal prayer to the god Amun, and he pleads, I am your son, protect me against troubles, protect me against the evil eye, protect my wives, let my children live, divert death from them for my sake, save me. 2 years pass. Taharqa hears nothing of the fate of his family. But then in 669, Asarhaddon dies unexpectedly. Taharqa, the warrior, senses potential, and he prepares his army for battle with the new Assyrian king, Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal is ruthless. He marches to Memphis and then further south to Thebes, Amun's homeland. Now, Taharqa is no martyr. Realizing he is no match for the Assyrian war machine, which is better equipped, which has iron weaponry rather than the bronze that the Nubians have, and they're more experienced because conquering, pillaging, and beheading is what they do. So I have to show you this banquet scene where Ashurbanipal is lying on a couch, and here in the tree, shown here in this blow up, you can see the head of the king of Babylon hanging. So they were ruthless. And we might imagine that Taharqa wisely understands this. And fighting this war machine would be futile. It would result in tremendous loss of life, deportation, destruction of all that he had built. So he returns to Nubia, thereby ending the monarchy of the double kingdom. But he continues to rule in Kush, where he dies 4 years later. It's 664 BC. He's 56 years old, an old man by ancient standards. But his final statement, his resting place for eternity, is yet another area where his architectural creativity shines through. And for that, he chooses a virgin site, Nuri. And he builds a new kind of pyramid, solid and with a very steep slope. This is, unfortunately, it's quite weathered and you no longer get that sense. But it is the highest pyramid in the Sudan. Sudan, by the way, has more pyramids than Egypt, but that's another subject. Nearly 104 feet tall and 100 feet per side. The burial is underneath the pyramid, accessed through a series of stairs that go off to the east. So you have to imagine that these black rectangles are pillars reaching to the ceiling. There's a central aisle and a podium in the middle. And on that podium would have been his coffin. The coffin would have been anthropoid or human shape, likely made of wood, covered in gold, and inlaid with these semi-precious stones. Gold covered, gem encrusted. Now, there was a high water table, so his coffin here would have looked like it was floating in water. All of the white area would have been flooded, except for the podium. So it would have looked like the coffin was floating on water, emerging from the primeval waters at the beginning of time, reborn annually when the flood receded. This was a replica of the tomb of the god Osiris, the god of rebirth. Now, the tomb itself was plundered in antiquity, but the robbers dropped this ring, this very ring that Taharqa himself wore. Now that they clearly dropped by mistake. Other things they probably left deliberately, including these figures, these small figures which lined the walls of the burial chamber to protect Taharqa in his journey to the afterlife. Now, there were at least 1,070 of these statuettes, ranging in size from about 6 inches to almost 12 inches. They're made of granite, serpentine, alabaster, sandstone, and other materials we have not yet identified. But each one of these is individually carved. And you can't help but think of the army of craftsmen, the organization, the skill in Nubia in the 7th century BCE. So this is Taharqa and his many visible manifestations of power. His tomb, his temples, his statues, his words, the words of the Assyrians about him, the words in the Bible about him. And I'd like to think that Taharqa got his wish to live eternally. So why isn't he, I have to ask, at the tip of our tongues? Why have most people today not heard of him? We should remember him as the leader of one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, as a brilliant strategist, a brave military hero, a creative architect, a pious man, a man who understood the power of monuments and the power of the word, a man who chose to surround himself with the best, whether Nubian or Egyptian, someone who soared to great heights and then suffered unbelievable tragedy, but rose again like the phoenix. The Greek geographer Strabo remembered him 700 years after his death as one of the great conquerors of the ancient world. Why don't we? Why isn't Nubian culture and civilization taught in our schools? I hope you will join me in doing what you can to make that happen. So thank you, but let me end with a giant shout out to the entire Hutchins staff and my co-fellows whose friendship and collegiality I'll cherish. You have been more helpful than you can ever imagine. It's a tremendous privilege to be here at the Hutchins Center. I've loved every minute, and I can't thank you enough, and thank you for listening.
Bravo. Bravo, bravo. Oh my God, I could hear you talk about Taharqa and Nubia forever, and you're such a great storyteller. The only way that stories enter the curriculum is through storytellers, is through narratives, right? You have to tell a good story. People love a good story. And the way you told that, I wish you would just publish it as the way it is. It's a little book. You could even make it a children's book, you know, or though it wasn't meant for children, but a small book that's illustrated. That was beautiful and self-contained. It was just great. And I know these stories, and I've been there, you know, twice. And I love every second. One thing you didn't say was explain that Jebel Barkal, in what Jebel Barkal looks like. You didn't actually say that. You know, that it looks like the crown, right? From the side. So that it's, when you see it, you go, oh my God, it's the thing. What do you call it?
Well, the cap crown of the Cushites with a double uraeus.
Yes, yes. It looks like that thing that the Egyptians wear with the snake on the top. Right? And it's just formed there in nature. And so everybody thought it was a holy place, and it was. But I just thought, did he ever get his wife and his children back?
No, at least not according to the records. And I'm
No.
sure he would have said something.
And we all know about Assyria. We know about that beard is stylized to represent the Assyrians. You know, I took a course in world history, ancient history, it was called, when I was 10 in the 5th grade in Piedmont. Yeah, and we learned about Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar and the Assyrians and the Fertile, you know, it was all about the Fertile Crescent, which was thought to be the origin of the humanity, you know, back in those days. The Tigris and the Euphrates. I still remember that class. It was, but no Taharqa. You know why? He ain't in there because he's black. You don't happen to have a picture of the Black Pharaoh statues that our friend unearthed, right?
One of the images of Taharqa I showed, that was from Kerma.
Okay.
It would take me, I can get that back up.
Okay, get that back up. I just want people to see that they represent themselves as black. In the midst of all those idealized images in the stone, and these which were discovered by Charles Bonnet.
Well, this is one of them. That's the face of the Taharqa he showed. Let me go back. This was found in 2003 or 4, one of 10 or 11 colossal statues of Taharqa and his successors found by Charles Bonnet, who you had here as an invited speaker who gave that fabulous series of lectures.
Oh yeah, it's amazing. And you could Google it, just the Black Pharaohs of the Nile, Dwight. You should get that book and keep it on your coffee table, because the statues of the black, you know, this was, well, at one point, what sometimes is called the Ethiopian dynasty, which is kind of weird. But this is the Nubian dynasty. You know, all these arguments, what color were the Egyptians? between 750 and 650 roughly, there's no doubt the pharaohs were black. I mean, bulak. And Taharqa was the baddest one of all. And he's in the Bible. And anyway, it's just brilliant and just riveting. You should publish this with illustrations, just this story, the way you told it.
Well, thank you. I'm really flattered. I just want to say on the blackness, not only did the Egyptians picture them and describe them as black, but the Assyrians did also. They very specifically singled out the Nubians as black. There was no doubt.
Right. Good. Questions, comments? Krishna, you want to curate?
Sure, thank you. Susanna Ashton.
Hi there, sorry. My question was a little mechanical. Just about the pyramid at the end, Rita, I was fascinated by the notion of the flooding. And maybe I missed it. So one, could you talk a little bit more how the pyramid was designed? I mean, did it channel the water specifically so that things would float inside, or was that just a metaphorical rebirth that you are interpreting it as? Or can you talk about the flooding of the pyramid? Was that common, where something would be designed to be flooded and reflooded, and the ebb and flow of the water? I mean, it's heart-rending when you think about it. It's fascinating. Thank you.
Well, it wasn't the pyramid itself that was flooded. The pyramid was like a block on top, and 52 steps underground was the burial chamber. So it's the burial chamber that was flooded. And there's a naturally high water table in that part of Nubia. In fact, they're actually scuba diving to get inside some of the burial chambers now. But so when the water was high, everything except the podium on which the coffin sat and the 6 pillars would have flooded. So it would have. So that was the imagery. And there is Osiris was the Egyptian god of the dead, and there is at Abydos in Egypt there is something that's considered the tomb of Osiris underground, and it's thought that this is modeled after that. And today that tomb of Osiris also has water. It also has water surrounding it. So, and I'm not the originator of the idea. It's, I think, a brilliant idea. I wish I were, but it nevertheless conjures up an incredible image. And another thing I didn't say, there are some inscriptions that were found, but not recorded as far as we know in the burial chamber of Taharqa, I'm sorry. His son and successor had a brilliantly painted burial chamber, and we might assume that Taharqa did as well. So we only know a small fraction of what there was, unfortunately.
Thank you. Nagla Abdallah.
Hi. So thank you, Rita, for this storytelling. It was really amazing. And I'm a proud Nubian. And the way that you said it, it's just like made me like flirt, and I am happy that it's coming out to the surface, and like everyone should know about the Black pharaohs and who's the Taharqa and who's the Kosh kingdom. Yeah, as you know, you ask a question why this is not have been like in the history of in the public schools. So I work with the public schools, and we have the Heritage Month, and we have actually like trying to tell the teachers, and I know that you have been working on that, just to let it come out to the surface. Thank you very much for this beautiful storytelling. And I did study it in Arabic, but it's no way like the way that you just telling us, as if it's like the first time I hear about it. No, I know it, but thank you very much. Thank you. It was amazing.
Thank you, Nagla. I'm so glad you could come.
One of our fellows has to leave early, Saku Cook. So please let me ask him to comment or question before Suzanne Blier. Thank you.
No problem. Thanks, Krishna, for letting me skip the line. And Rita, thanks for that presentation. I love the idea of presenting him as an architect, because I'm in the business of finding and looking for Black architects, and the Blackness is something that has been kind of erased from architecture. Architectural history and how architecture is taught, and taught from a very Western perspective. So presenting him as a Black architect, as one of these historical figures, as a Black architect, is really powerful for me. So just thank you for that.
Well, thank you. Let me say, I just scratched the surface of his architecture. I think I already went over time, but what he did in almost every way was unique and beautifully designed, and designed with a message. And it's just unfortunate that not much is preserved today, and not much is preserved in part because the Egyptians, when the Nubians challenged Egypt later, one of the Egyptian kings rampaged through Nubia, destroyed all the statues, and also deliberately hacked out Taharqa and other Nubian kings' names and the double uraeus wherever they could. So there was a deliberate attempt at destruction in antiquity, not to mention later.
Yeah, and is that one of the reasons that Taharqa and company didn't make my 5th grade ancient history course?
Where did you grow up?
Well, I grew up in Piedmont, West Virginia, halfway between Pittsburgh and Washington. It was just a textbook and county on ancient history. But it's a metaphor. I'm just saying, why didn't they? What is your theory about why, when people think about the great kingdom of the ancient world, Nubia is not there unless we're in a Black history class, or it's Black History Month, or a very advanced class, sophisticated school system? The answer, of course, is because they were Black. That's what all Black people think, first of all. But what is the real reason? Why were they erased? They were in the Bible, for goodness sake, which everybody read. Taharqa was.
Well, I can't disagree with you, but I think there's more to it than that. I think that unless we see the glories of Greek and Roman civilization in museums all over, we see Egyptian objects all over, but where other than Sudan do you see Nubian objects right now? There are a few places, I can name them, but unless
Boston, MFA.
Well, I have to say that right now, unfortunately, they're not on view. Now, I think when people see things, they want to know more about them. And I think that that's also part of it. When so many people want to study things when they can stand underneath a 15-foot tall statue and see themselves in it. But if they can't see that, they're not going to know about it. And I think that it's not simple to put a 15-foot tall statue on view, for sure. But I think unless we do that, unless we find other ways to tell the stories, they're not going to be known. I think we can all play a role there. And I think now's the time.
Give us your bullet points. And where's Abby? We'll do it. We're talking about canonization. Stories are canonized. And what we need is we have to get the story of Nubia. Nubia is the kingdom of Kush. You say Napata, I say Napata, Meroe. It's all the same place, just evolving over time. And it goes, my fellow fellows, all the way to the Christian era. And I filmed there, the Christian art of Nubia, when finally disappearing, I don't know when, from Meroe to, when does the Christian era end of architecturally?
I see Professor Blier is in the audience, and that is her specialty. So let me defer to her. I think when the Muslims come and gradually take over, but I'd love to hear what Suzanne has to say.
Well, I'm riveted. I'm floored. I knew it was going to be wonderful, and it was extraordinary. And let me just say what Skip said in spades. Get this out here as a short book, beautifully illustrated, and let's get it into the schools and into popular culture. It was simply extraordinary. And also what Negla and Sekou said by way of comments. Hats off, Rita. It's just fabulous. So I've got a couple of questions. I mean, I think that to answer the last question, we have assumed that once Islam came into Egypt, that was it. And basically, so much of Christianity was simply wiped out. But it is continuing on into the 13th, 14th, 15th century in key places in the South. On either side of the Nile. And I think a lot of the trade, certainly with West Africa, is continuing in part through the oases where a lot of these traditions were maintained. And of course, Christianity is mixed deeply at this juncture and even early on with African traditions of various sorts. But my questions are, one, they're going to be they're going to sound random, but they're not. They're inspired by your talk. On the flooding, was the flooding damage less in the South because of the where Nubia was? Is there a difference there between North and South that might in part account for that? Second question on the marathon, that floored me. And I'm thinking about the time, and I'm thinking about the Greek traditions, and wondering, is there some claim here for early marathon traditions so that we can think about the Olympics as an African tradition? The next question, I've always known that the heads of some of these Nubian sculptures were defaced later. And what I had read was the noses in particular, and I never thought of it as a racial issue. But I'm wondering, we always think of it as just destruction and effacing of the features of important figures, but I'm wondering if noses is a kind of part to this. And then finally, the impossible question that Skip would usually ask, but he didn't do it because I think we were enthralled with your riveting talk. On the issue of scale and why, I'm curious about the timing of when he had those sculptures built and the columns. But also, I mean, we know about Napoleon. He was short. He was a great military leader, and scale and bigness was important to him. Do we know anything about his size, or is this in part scales critically important in both Egyptian and Syrian art? The winners are tall and those defeated are short. Is this to say in part that he is superior over the Egyptians by way, not within a relief, two-dimensional portrayals, but within the context of Egyptian art more generally? He's just saying, I'm lording over you in my achievements. I'm coming from the South. I'm conquering the North. I fought back the Assyrians, and get used to it.
Wow, where to start? Lots of great things to think about. About the flooding. The Nile Valley in Egypt is different from the Nile Valley in Sudan. In Egypt, you have limestone graduating to sandstone. And those are soft stones, so the floodplain, the area that floods is vast. In Nubia, the bedrock is granite. And the Nile channel is a lot deeper. So even though the Nile rises, it doesn't overflow the banks, except in select areas. And those areas are the areas of habitation, Kerma, Napatan, Merowe. That's really where you have the greatest habitation. So yes, a high flood, and also you get monsoon rains in Nubia, which you don't really get. They contribute to the height of the Nile. But I think you're right that there would have been probably less damage in Nubia, and it would have been something incredible for Taharqa to see this 36-foot Nile. About the marathon, I think this is just something unique. There is, to my knowledge, there is no mention in Egyptian sources of any kind of marathon like this. And if we're talking about 675 BC, we don't really know when the marathon took place, where in that 26 years between 690 and 664. To my knowledge, that's earlier than any Greek marathon that we know of, although I'm not an expert at that. So it may be that the marathon is an African thing, and you have to add in the heat. They ran it at night, by the way, partly because of that. So pretty amazing. As to whether the knocking off of noses was meant racially, maybe some of it was, but let me just say that it was done in a widespread way in Egypt as well as Sudan, in Egyptian art and Nubian art. In fact, I have described faces and forgotten to mention that the noses had been knocked off because it is so commonplace. Now, but looking at this within the perspective of Egyptian religion, the soul inhabited the statue. And the soul could come and go freely through the eyes, the ears, the mouth, the nose, the open areas in the face. Now, if you damage the nose, and also the eyes are often nicked and the mouth is often damaged and the ears as well. So if you damage these sensory areas, you prevent the soul from coming and going. You prevent the soul inside the statue from coming out and cursing you and hurting you. So they were ritually killed in this way, which is not to say that other things didn't enter into it. Surely Christians played a role in this too, because they didn't want those ancient spirits around.
Yes, but we also need to remember that if you're swinging something like toward a statue, you're going to hit the nose first because the nose protrudes. So for all the metaphysical reasons, there's a physical reason, right?
Oh,
And,
absolutely.
Yeah, and I would remind you of the most controversial nose defacing in the history of Egyptology is the defacing of the Sphinx. And it's controversial because of Sheikh Anta Diop. If you look at Sheikh Anta Diop's, major book, he's got these photographs. His theory is that the Sphinx had a Negro nose, an African nose. And there's an apocryphal story that Napoleon's troops, fired a cannon at it to deface it because it was a black, an N-word nose. And this is a highly controversial, probably dubious, but it's a fascinating thesis. And he has these reconstructed noses. It's worth getting the book just to see these pictures of the Sphinx with a Negro nose. So.
Is this the Souls of Black Folk?
No, that's Du Bois. Sheikh Anta Diop.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
Ancient, whatever Diops. Can somebody, Krista, can you Google DIOP, Chris? To get the name of his book, Sheikh, Chiek, Anta Diop.
Well, Chris is doing that. Let me just say that there's a famous etching in the Description de l'Egypte of Napoleon's savants on the Sphinx. They appear to be measuring the Sphinx, and it already at that time has the damaged nose. We think that the Mamluks did it. The Mamluks used it for target practice. Now, this doesn't mean it was any less racial. It just takes it back to a Mamluk dynasty rather than.
And when were the Mamluks, or is it Mamluk?
Mamluk. I think it was 14th century, but somebody should correct me.
Kristen, did you find the name of Diop's book?
Yes, several. I'm not sure which one contains that information. One is here I'm translating from the French, Negro Nations and Culture.
No, this book's in English. It's called like Civilization in Africa or something like that. Do you have the English titles?
No, I just see the French here.
Oh, okay. Well,
Oh, here
I'll
it is.
send,
The African origin of civilization.
yeah, that's it. Thank you. And Tanya just put it in the chat. African
Okay.
Origin of Civilization, which was based on his PhD thesis at the Sorbonne. And anyway, he's got these illustrations. And so somebody took target practice at the Sphinx's nose.
Absolutely.
Anyway, keep going. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, just to answer Suzanne's question about scale, size equals hierarchy for sure. And it's something that the Egyptians did as well. And I can't say, there are actually, there are a number of images where Egyptians and Nubians are shown together on an equal basis, but they're from the Napatan dynasty, few and far between. Generally, when the Egyptians are shown as conquered peoples in Nubia, they are shown on a smaller scale. And generally, you demean your enemies, the people you fear, you demean them in any way possible. You show them as prisoners, you have them on the bottom of walking sticks so that you pound on them, or on your footstool so that you put your feet on them. There are ever so many ways that you demean somebody, but definitely the idea of size equaling hierarchy is present. And in later Meroitic times, you see some temple pylons where there are images of, there is almost nothing else on the face of the pylon, but the image of the king on one side and the queen on the other side, smiting enemies. So these are billboards, and you can't help these things could be 4 stories high, and as you stand in front of them, you're in awe. So for sure, there's something to this. As to Taharqa himself, unfortunately, there's nothing in the way of anatomical remains in his tomb. So we have no way of knowing what his height was. In fact, all the Napatan period tombs have been plundered, although not all completely, but we don't have any human remains of the royalty, unfortunately.
Thank you. Marwa?
Hi, thank you, Rita. Thank you so much. I could listen to you talk about ancient Egypt and Nubia all day. I think I agree. I really think this needs to become some kind of short story or a book, or maybe even an audiobook with you narrating it, because I think it isn't just the stories we tell, it's the way we tell them that can sort of make people feel a certain way about the past and how it connects to the present. But one of the things you brought up in your presentation was the question of gender. And I'm really interested by that. You talked about the differences between, ancient Egypt, the role of women in ancient Egypt versus in ancient Nubia. And so I wondered if, one, you could talk a little bit more about that and what we could know, or what we do know about the different roles that women played, and maybe some of the reasons why women's roles were different. And then I just think it's fantastic that you're talking about women and thinking about women. And I wonder, especially because I'm remembering the uprisings and then the Sudanese, protests, and the role that women played and the way that they draw on the past in these protests. And so I wonder if you could maybe speak a little bit more about how you see gender playing out in your broader project, and maybe some ways that you might, if possible, draw connections between past and present.
That's intriguing. Yes, we do have a strong sense that women played a more important role in Nubia than in Egypt. They're, in fact, in their role as queen mothers, we think they played a part in the selection of the future king. And moreover, from a slightly later period, we have an indication that the coronation was not considered finished, complete, until the queen mother came and actually put the crown on the head of the king. And this is all told to us through inscriptions. From Meroe later, which is about 350 BC to 350 AD, there were women who ruled in their own right, not as substitutes for kings, but as they ruled as kings, which happens very, very seldom and usually by chance in Egypt. It's a more complex question. But when there was a Amanirenas about 30 AD, I think, challenged the Roman garrison at Elephantine and walked away with the head of the Emperor Augustus. And as a result of that, there was a truce between, as a result of this queen, there was a truce between the Romans and the Nubians, resulting in the Romans staying away and not invading Nubia. And that truce was really never broken. So, and on temples, the temple I referred to was the temple at the site called Naga, has which is beautifully preserved. On the pylon, on one side you have the king writ large smiting, on the other side you have the queen writ equally large smiting. And in terms of large, the Nubian aesthetic was very different from the Egyptian aesthetic. And size, again, equaled power. So the Nubian queens on these temples are voluptuous. They are shown proudly with pendant breasts, broad rear ends, folds of flesh, because this, if you had enough, cattle is wealth too. If you had enough to eat, you were not skinny. And this was their ideal of beauty. So they were not shy. They very much were individuals. And unfortunately, the language of the time, Meroitic, while we do have a lot of inscriptions from that 350 BC to 350 AD period, we don't know how to read it. Well, let me rephrase that. We don't know, we can read it, but we can't translate it. So I know there is a linguist around, and I hope that there is progress being made, but not enough. So one day we'll know more. But thank you, Mara. Happy to talk to you later about this.
Thank you. Kate?
Rita, I know that I've said to you every single time I see you that I can't wait to teach with this, that I really do hope that this is accessible, that it's something that we can all pick up and put into our curricula. I'm very excited about the project. And as I was thinking about it as a story to be told in sort of survey class. And it made me want to ask you about sort of the labor and the way that archaeologists working in this region have thought a lot about the history of enslavement as part of the production of these monuments. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how or whether that figures in your story, because on the one hand, to set this king alongside the other great kings of the ancient world is what makes this a stunning case study for the curriculum, right? And on the other hand, I know that my students would also be asking this question about kind of labor and how do we think about this? And so in some ways, the sort of straddling of the sort of middle and lower Nile, these sort of two worlds, and the sort of new articulations of race and engagement with these kinds of conversations is one way to kind of set him up in a way that's sort of accessible for students. But I did wonder about the labor question, because I think they'd be asking me about that at my school, at least.
I wish we knew. It's one of those things that what we have is what Taharqa and the other kings wanted us to have. And organization of labor, well, we do know a lot more in Egypt because of some of the archaeological work that's been done relatively recently. We don't know, workmen's villages, for example. We don't right now have that for Sudan or for Nubia. And whether, slavery is, slavery certainly existed in the ancient world. These were captives of war, but we don't know a lot about the institution per se. Again, we don't, particularly for Nubia, have the writings of the average person. And these are things that would, and we barely have any writings other than those of royalty. So these are not things they would talk about. However, it may be that as people continue to excavate things other than temples and tombs, that they'll discover more about the habitation sites, and it's possible there'll be some traces that might be, or, frankly, from the skeletal remains, we can tell how people were treated. Whether they were slaves or not is another question, but how if somebody dies at a young age because of broken bones and arthritis, then that's a pretty good idea that they were worked to death. So I think there's more to come. I'm really optimistic about all the work that's going on now in Sudan. So I hope we'll have an answer for your students before very long.
The way, if I may, quickly, because I got to bail at 2, but you all go as long as you want, of course. The way to integrate the story in is to find the way we did the Norton. It's to find, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Find the wheel. Find the textbook that's used to tell the story of the ancient world, right? And then we go to the editors and say, you forgot the story. So that's the simplest way. You don't have to come up like this, you go like this. And in this climate, they would respond. You would say, what we need to do is look at an 8th grade textbook or a senior, I have no idea who's teaching ancient history in the schools. But somebody will. God knows we are excellent in research. Krishna, why don't you talk to Abby and Rita, and we figure out. We talk to Kevin, Dr. Burke is on the line, and see what textbooks are out there. And then we write to the editors, right? And say, this is a story that needs to be told. And guess what? Rita, all you have to do is transcribe this tape and give it to them. It's the chapter in the book. It's fabulous. It's done with pictures too. You see what I mean? Just making sense? That's how we have integrated the canon. We took canonical monuments and integrated them. We didn't try to make new monuments. We took the Norton anthology and we integrated the American, and we created the Norton anthology of African American. We took the American national biography, we integrated that, but we created the African American national biography, et cetera, et cetera. That is the strategy for canon reformation. And we could do that easily. So just give me a name. Give me a name of a book and the name of an editor, and I'll call it turkey. And we'll get Taharqa canonized because he's my man. And if they don't like it, we'll do our own book on ancient history. Krishna, go ahead. I have to sign off, Rita. I'm sorry, but I have a 2:00 meeting. And this is fabulous. You guys stay on. Sending love to everybody. I want Michael to ask some question about the socialism of the Black man of the Nile. Yeah, Michael, they weren't in the socialism. The only socialism was Taharqa. And he socialized everybody's money and labor and everything else. Anyway, see you all. Take care.
Mohammed, Khalifa.
Yes, thank you, Krishna. And thank you, Rita, so much for this wonderful enlightenment. And as we are talking about books, in front of me, there are 3 Bibles. I consider them my own Bibles when it comes to Nubian. The first one is the Nubian pharaohs. And as everybody knows, what is the picture on it? The front picture of that greatest man, yes, Rita was telling us about. The second book is The First of the Sun. It's by the NFA, and this is a beautiful collection of the Nubians' antiquities. And the third one, which is important, and I always use it, is The Wonder of the African World by our greatest skipper, who just skipped this presentation, but I know he's busy. But I mentioned these 3 books because they tell us a lot. But today, in this very presentation, and as a Nubian, I listened to one of the 3 contributors to these 3 books, actually 2 of them. Henry Lewis was here, Professor Gates, and they spoke passionately about such history. And when it comes to Taharqa, the greatest of all, I believe Rita just managed to give us a real insight out of such wonderful king who did contribute, and not just to the Nubian, but to the entire world, and especially the Black history, as we talked in the Black History Months. So thank you so much. My last point is, as we all mentioned, and I know Rita mentioned it in her presentation, is that we don't have that much. We only have the remains and the pictures. But we also have the written word. We have the Merovingian language, and we really need to work all together. If not from this very Hutchins Center or Harvard or this very Princeton, which is very rich of Nubian heritage, where we can try to decipher this language. I will encourage each one of us to think it over and think it again and do his very best or her very best to work on such project where we can decipher this language, and we will be all able to read what we are missing from such wonderful history. Thank you again for all of you.
Well, thank you, Mohammed. I just want to say, I know there is a linguist among us, Sandro, and may I ask you if you've ever done any work with Merowitic? I know your area is somewhat different, but do you know what the status is of the language and the translation attempts?
Yes, I've taken classes, 1 year of classes of Merowitic with Claude Rey in Paris.
Oh, wow.
Actually, religious texts are quite stereotypical and quite easy to understand at this point for him, but other texts are much more difficult to understand. I also wanted to say that Claude Rey argues that there was a word for slave in Merowitic, although it logically was related to working the land rather than monuments. But he said that there was a word for slave. So, yeah.
Well, fascinating. Claude Rey is the god of Merowitic. And you will know more than I do, but as I understand it, he's looking at Old Nubian, he's looking at languages in Chad, in the Kordofan Mountains, and finding a lot of cognates. But so there's hope in the future. Yeah, I hope in the near future.
Yes. There's a lot of languages from which he says are related to Merowitic, and it's very probably the case, and some of them have not been described in detail. And he says that the more languages will be described, the more easily we will be able to construct Merowitic and understand it properly.
Thanks.
Thank you. Mohammed Khalifa, people are wondering whether or not you would mind posting the names of the books you just mentioned.
Yeah, sure. The first book is The Pharaoh of the Sun, and that's by the MFA in Boston, The Pharaoh of the Sun. The second book is The Nubian Pharaohs, Black Kings of the Nile, and that's by our very dear Charles Bonnet and Dominic Valbel. And last is A Wonder of the African World by Henry Louis Gates Jr. These are actually a very important to have next to anyone who's really interested in this Brigitte's history. Krishna, you want me to write them down or?
You
As-
may, I think I jotted them down. I can
Got them. Okay, beautiful, beautiful.
Yes.
Thank you.
send it out later. Thank you. Does anyone else have questions or comments? Well, if not, Rita, thank you so much for a captivating talk. And I think the die is cast. The book is on its way.
I'm not sure how to respond to that, but I have my work cut out for me. Thank you.
Thank you.